This is a Global News special presentation.
Surprise, April Fools! I'm just kidding. This is actually for real.
From her announcement seeking the leadership of the UCP in May to a final ballot victory to become Alberta's next premier.
I'm back!
It's been a milestone year for Danielle Smith. 8 years after a controversial floor crossing from the Wild Rose to the Conservatives ended her first run at politics, she's made an unlikely comeback, taking aim at the federal government.
We are going to make sure that we push back against their invasion.
Ushering in bold, sometimes controversial changes for the province.
Today marks a new dawn for Alberta, for Canada, and for the federation that binds us together.
And setting the stage for what's sure to be a hard-fought election next year. This is a conversation with the Premier. So, Premier, thanks so much for joining us.
My
We do
pleasure.
appreciate it. It has obviously been a very big year for you. You were recently sworn in just a couple months ago as Alberta's 19th Premier. How would you describe your year and how the first few months been on the job?
The first couple of months on the job have been just amazing from a team building point of view. I know that during the leadership race it got a little bit fractious, and so people were really concerned about unity, especially with the kind of couple of years that our party has had. But I must tell you, I'm just so impressed with the other leadership candidates and my caucus team and my ministerial team. Everybody has been really constructive in bringing forward ideas. We've been able to build that into identifying our priorities, and I think people are feeling really good about where we're at.
So obviously your first order of business as a legislator was bringing in the Sovereignty Act, which you did have to make amendments to very quickly over this interpretation that it was going to give you and your cabinet some pretty sweeping powers outside of the legislature floor. So how is it that you guys wrote a law that really the entire country was watching for and had to make those kind of significant changes so quickly?
You know what I was most concerned about is that people had initially misinterpreted what I was trying to do with it. So we made sure that we called it the Alberta Sovereignty Within a United Canada Act, because initially all of the coverage was that somehow this had something to do with leaving Canada. And I wanted to make sure that people understood that was not the case. It was about underscoring our constitutional rights, as well as making sure that people understood that we were going to defend the charter rights of our citizens. And so the whole process was meant to start with the legislature, because I respect the authority of MLAs to make decisions and give direction. And that was, I think, part of the reason why the act needed to be amended a bit, is that I think we had felt that by having it begin in the legislature and have the legislature give direction to cabinet, that we would be able to put the agenda in place. But I think it became pretty clear that MLAs said that if there was going to be any statutory change, they'd want that to come back to go through the regular process. I thought that was a reasonable change, so we made it, and I think we've got a really good bill.
So how was that put in there in the first place, though?
It was put in because I think because the whole process started in the legislature, we envisioned that the motion would say all of the different changes that needed to be made. And because it began as a legislative process with the affirmation of the MLAs, I think we felt that we could probably draft the initial motion that would have been able to address those issues. The MLAs felt differently. They felt like they wanted to make sure if there was any legislative change that it came back, and so that was the change that we made.
So you recently suggested that the Sovereignty Act could be used, for example, to fight something like the federal government's ban on single-use plastics. And you'd said on your radio show, we could maybe still have plastic straws, for example, in this province, if the act had been in place and if it was used properly. Is that the kind of thing that this legislation was meant for?
We actually have taken a constitutional challenge against the federal government for usurping our area of jurisdiction. They identified plastics as toxic, and I think it's actually kind of absurd that the federal government would invade our jurisdiction and then their marquee legislation is doing something like banning straws and banning plastic utensils and banning stir sticks, when in fact they've created a huge amount of turmoil in our petrochemical industry, because now they've interfered with the cross-border trade in one of our principal industries. So it may seem like a frivolous example, but I think we have to question why it is the federal government felt that it was so important to invade our jurisdiction if that was the kind of outcome it was going to have. We have to make sure that we're defending our constitutional jurisdiction, and that includes the ability to defend our principal resource sectors. And that's part of the reason why we've launched a constitutional challenge on it. That happened prior to me becoming Premier.
Have you had a chance to discuss with your cabinet areas where they believe that the Sovereignty Act could not just theoretically but practically be used in the coming months, and more specifically even before the next election?
I think one of the areas that we see the biggest problem being is that the federal government is using environmental pretext to invade our jurisdiction. And we've seen it with declaring plastics toxic. We've seen it with the aggressive targets that they want to do around biodiversity goals and protected land designations. We've seen it with aggressive emissions caps that they've proposed for fertilizer and for oil and natural gas. We've seen it with pronouncements from our environment minister that he doesn't want us using natural gas on our power grid anymore. And these are the kind of things that I think that the federal government is attempting to do to create an environment where we have to reduce production. If you've got aggressive targets that are unachievable in too short a time frame, you can call it an emissions cap, but really it's a production cap. And that violates Section 92A of the Charter of Rights of the Constitution. We have the right to develop our resources. We have the right to determine the pace. We've got the right to determine conservation policy. We also have the right to export it to other provinces to get it to market. And I think the federal government is continuously putting measures in place to try to override that right. And that's part of the reason why we're pushing back against it.
I want to ask about a comment you made in question period when you compared Alberta sovereignty, or the idea of Alberta sovereignty, to Indigenous sovereignty. You said that Alberta's treatment by Ottawa was just like First Nations treatment by the federal government under the Indian Act. In hindsight, do you think that's a fair comment, and do you stand by that?
Well, I didn't want my comments to be misconstrued, so I apologize for it. But what I've observed with First Nations is they've asserted their sovereignty over the last 20 years. And those who have developed their own structures on reserve have been able to escape some of the paternalism of the Indian Act. I think what has happened in Canada is we've been a bit passive, is that we've allowed Ottawa to invade our jurisdiction, and now we're going to assert our autonomy so in a very similar way. So I respect First Nations jurisdiction. I look at it as a nation-to-nation relationship. I'm going to continue to partner with them on areas that we should partner, but I think we've got a common problem. We've got a common problem with Ottawa treating us both in a paternalistic way and interfering in our areas of jurisdiction and interfering with our autonomy. So I'm going to make sure that I respect First Nations jurisdiction to keep on doing what they're doing, and we're just going to make sure that we get Ottawa to respect our autonomy as well.
And now that it's passed, the Sovereignty Act has faced, again, more criticism. First Nations groups, we've heard from municipal governments that have problems with it, academics. What makes you so sure that you're right about this and they're wrong?
There's lots of constitutional lawyers who have weighed in and said there's nothing unconstitutional about it. In fact, I was pleased to hear former Supreme Court Justice Jack Major say, what's so wrong with the province telling Ottawa, if you pass laws, make sure that they're in line with the Constitution? That's all this is. I had another constitutional lawyer write and say there would be no need for this act if only Ottawa stayed within its areas of constitutional power. Look, provinces don't go out of their way to pass unconstitutional laws that violate federal jurisdiction. We respect the fact that our Constitution says that there's certain things that are federal powers. So why isn't that reciprocal? Why aren't they a lot more hesitant to pass laws that they know violate our jurisdiction? They do it all the time, whether it's on natural resource rights or whether it's on our areas of social services provision. They're constantly using the federal spending power to try to give us dollars with strings attached, and that is an appropriate use of a federal spending power. We believe that we need a partnership, that we should identify our priorities, and if they want to partner with us on funding, great. But they shouldn't be trying to dictate how we deliver our programs. That's the approach that Quebec has always taken, and they, I think, have a measure of respect from Ottawa that, quite frankly, Ottawa doesn't give us, and we're trying to assert that they should treat us differently.
Up next, Danielle Smith on the healthcare system and affordability.
I think that we have to target it to those who really are the ones who are struggling the most in this inflation crisis.
As a conversation with the Premier continues.
I want to talk about affordability. As you know, Albertans are having a harder and harder time paying for the basics, and your government recently brought in a number of measures to try to address this. One-time payments for children, $600 for seniors, a pause in the gas tax and utility rebates. Some families say it's just not enough. It's not going to help us enough. Could there be more affordability measures coming from your government, and what would you say to those families?
We have to do a very careful balance between making sure that we're providing support but not adding to the inflation crisis. So in the past, there have been lump sum $500 payments. We felt if we did that would have actually fueled inflation and wouldn't have been targeted. So we wanted to make sure that we paced out the support over a period of time when we know people have higher bills. And in fact, because of the way that we're approaching it, by making sure that we're addressing some of the cost drivers, whether it's the energy costs and having some approaches around electricity prices and natural gas bills, but also gasoline and diesel taxes, we think that that's going to work against the inflationary pressures. I think the measures that we've done so far have actually reduced the inflationary aspect by 0.7%, and that's the reason why we did it the way we did. There's probably more that we can do. My affordability and utilities minister said that even for an individual or couple, they will get $900 of benefit from what we're proposing. There's going to obviously be more benefit to seniors and families with children and the most vulnerable, but I think that we have to target it to those who really are the ones who are struggling the most in this inflation crisis.
Alberta is in the midst of a pretty serious health crisis. Hospitals, as you know, full of sick children. We have a shortage of family doctors. The new AHS administrator that you appointed said pretty early on that he thought with the new direction that your government was taking, we could see some positive, tangible changes within as little as 30 days. It's been about a month now. Have you seen any changes, and what would those be?
What I'm watching is what the pressure is on our emergency rooms. We have a website where we look at how long those waits are. And just a week after Dr. John Cowell was appointed, we were seeing wait times of 10 and 12 and 17 hours. And we haven't seen anything like that, and we're a month in. And part of the reason for that is that we've worked really collaboratively with our frontline workers to make sure that we're load leveling and moving patients around so that we don't put extra pressure on individual hospitals. We've got fast tracks so that if somebody comes in with a minor ailment, they can be treated and released more quickly. And we're also working with paramedics to ensure that we have a new system of being able to address routine transfers so that we don't have the long waiting lists or the long waiting lines that happen at emergency rooms. The next major step that Dr. Cowell is going to take is looking at how we can clear our surgical backlog list. We've got 69,000 surgeries that are in the queue, and many of them are surgeries that are beyond what is medically recommended, and that's just unacceptable. We've got one of the most well-invested healthcare systems in the entire country and in the world, and yet we're not getting the kind of results that I think Albertans expect. So I would say that that's what we're going to be judged on, is if you need to get picked up in an ambulance and get dropped off, can you do that quickly? Or are you going to be sitting for hours in the back of an ambulance? If you go to an emergency room, are you going to be seen and treated quickly, or are you going to wait 29 hours? And if you are waiting for a knee or hip replacement, are you getting it in a reasonable period of time, or are you waiting 4 years? So we have a baseline that I inherited, and those are the measures I'm looking at, and I think we'll be judged on that basis. And I think people will see progress very soon.
Coming up,
it turned out to be a very bad decision.
the Premier on controversial past comments and where she says her opinions have evolved. Next.
There have been some headlines recently about comments that you've made in the past that have created controversy, both recently and really in the distant past. And you've suggested that some of the things that you've said, say as a talk show host, for example, shouldn't really count anymore because you weren't in politics at the time. I want to ask you how you think that voters are supposed to view you or judge you as a potential candidate for premier in the next election if they can't rely on things that you've said in the past being an indicator of who you would be as premier.
Well, when you're a talk show host, you take on provocative issues, because your job is to be provocative and your job is to have really tough discussions about the issues that are out there in the media and that people are talking about. When you're premier, your job is to solve problems. And I'm not interested in provoking Albertans into getting them fighting with each other and being angry. That's not my job. My job is to try to find solutions and to find areas of common ground so that we can agree. So that's, I think, the fundamental difference, is that when you're in the media, you kind of take the issues as they emerge, whereas in government, you have to identify issues that are problems, and you've got to work in good faith to be able to solve them. So I think they're just different jobs.
But isn't it fair for people to take things that you've said in the past and assume that you believe them?
The difference in politics is that it's a team. That I'm not a dictator. I have to make sure that anything that I do, number one, gets the support of the people. Number two, has the support of my caucus. Number three, has the support of my ministers. Number four, has the support of stakeholders. And number five, has as much collaboration as possible. So it's quite different when you're in the media and you're able to just pontificate on whatever happens to be the issue of the day. But when you're in a leadership position, you've got to make sure that you've got your team behind you. So it's going to be a very different process.
I know that you've said, and you brought this up in your address to the province, is that your opinions have evolved on a number of different issues over the years. I just want to ask, what specifically were you talking about? What areas have your opinions evolved?
Well, I would say there's a couple. I mean, obviously, I thought I was making the right decision to bring our parties together in 2014 when I made that decision, and it turned out to be a very bad decision. And I spent 7 years trying to re-earn the trust of people to be able to run for politics again. I would say that's one. On the issue of greenhouse gas emissions, that's another area. I was one of the, I think one of the first conservatives to say that we could meet a carbon neutral target. And I've been doing all kinds of work over the last number of years to talk about carbon technology, carbon capture and storage, talk about hydrogen, talk about how we might be able to export more LNG to reduce emissions around the world, talk about nature-based solutions. So I think that's one area where I've seen how our industry and innovation is really going to be able to solve this problem, and I'm very excited about that. So I would say those are a couple things.
I know another area where you said that your opinion had evolved was on the comments you made about Ukraine, and you did apologize for those. But an area you didn't apologize for was saying that unvaccinated people were the most discriminated against group that you'd seen in your lifetime, despite calls from a number of different minority groups that you do that. Why was that?
Unvaccinated people were discriminated against, and I'm glad to see that most of our businesses have moved on from that. Not all, but I've made my position on it very clear that we shouldn't have any discrimination in this province for any reason, and I'm looking forward to those last companies that are still having practices that aren't in line with that. I'm looking forward to working with them to make them a lot more embracing of where we need to go. We need to treat medical choice as a choice, and we need to be treating COVID as endemic, and that means that we need to have some new practices. I'm pretty clear about that.
But you understand why groups would have been upset when you said they were the most discriminated against group in your lifetime. Do you still believe that?
I'm glad that we no longer have people banned from going to restaurants and banned from leaving the country and banned from watching their kids play hockey games. That was pretty hard for people. I'm glad we no longer have people being fired from their jobs for not being vaccinated. Those are all very positive, and I just want to make sure that doesn't ever happen again.
Still ahead, who is Danielle Smith outside of politics?
I'm going to really date myself. I was a Duran Duran fan back in the day.
When a conversation with the Premier returns.
I think Albertans want to know a little bit more about who Danielle Smith is outside of politics. So we have a couple rapid fire questions here for you to give people a bit of a better sense of who you are. What's your favorite movie?
My favorite movie is Groundhog Day.
And why is that?
I probably, it's so funny because it is about the same day happening over and over, and I've probably watched it 20 or 30 times. I did read that I think they envisioned initially that the character was in the same day for 10,000 years, if you can imagine that. So I think it's, I just love Bill Murray as an actor. It's such a fun show.
What are you reading right now?
I am not reading as much as I would like to. A lot of briefs.
Legislation, maybe?
A lot of briefs.
Yeah.
My staff keeps me pretty busy. But when I do have a rare moment to read, I was reminded of Unfinished Business, which was a book that Ralph Klein had his cabinet read when he first got elected.
I
so
read
Roger
that, yeah.
Douglas. Yeah, so I'm working my way through that one.
What's your favorite recording artist? Do you have one?
I'm gonna really date myself. I was a Duran Duran fan back in the day, so anytime Hungry Like the Wolf comes, and I noticed this because in the restaurants they're all playing Duran Duran now, so I know that they're trying to target to my demographic.
I like the honesty there, Duran. What's your favorite vacation spot?
It has been Puerto Vallarta for years and years and years, but I've just discovered Panama, and so that's going to be my new vacation spot.
And who is Danielle Smith in her downtime? What do you do for fun?
I like to I like to laze around with a morning coffee, looking out the window, dogs at my feet, and then bundle myself up and go for a long walk in one of the dog parks in town, and then go and enjoy an afternoon beer or wine with my husband at our favorite restaurant. That's probably about a perfect day.
Premier Danielle Smith, thanks so much for making the time. We do appreciate it.
My pleasure.